In April 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh. They told the population it was liberation. Within 24 hours, they had emptied the entire city at gunpoint. Hospitals, schools, markets, streets. Anyone who resisted was shot where they stood. 4 years later, nearly 2 million Cambodians were dead, a quarter of the entire population gone, and the men who did it called it Year Zero. What really happened inside history's deadliest regimes? Not the names you already know, not the death tolls. What I want to show you today is something more disturbing than any statistic. Because every regime in this video, Soviet Russia, Maoist China, Cambodia under Pol Pot, Nazi Germany, they all followed the exact same four-phase playbook. The same promise, the same enemy, the same machine, the same collapse. And nobody talks about that, because if you understand the pattern, you stop seeing these regimes as historical accidents. You start seeing them as a predictable sequence of events. And here's what makes that deeply uncomfortable. It is being triggered right now. To really understand how the deadliest regimes in history built their power, you have to first understand what they all said they were. Because none of them came to power promising death. They all came to power promising salvation. Phase 1. The Promiser. Russia, 1917. The Tsar has fallen. The country is starving. Soldiers are dying by the hundreds of thousands in a war that no longer makes sense to anyone. And into that vacuum steps a man named Vladimir Lenin with a 3-word promise that electrified an entire nation. Peace, land, bread. That was it. 3 words. For a population that had none of those things, it was everything. The Bolsheviks didn't seize power through terror, not at first. They seized it through an idea that felt like oxygen to people who were suffocating. China, 1949, a country that has spent decades under colonial humiliation, Japanese invasion, civil war. Mao Zedong stands in Tiananmen Square and declares, "The Chinese people have stood up. Not I am in charge. We, the people, have stood up together." Cambodia, 1975, a country that has been bombed for years. American carpet bombing during the Vietnam War left hundreds of thousands of Cambodians dead. Into that devastation came Pol Pot, promising a return to a simpler, purer Cambodia, an agrarian utopia, a place where the corruption of the city would simply be abolished. The promise always fits the wound. That is the first rule of Phase 1. Every regime identifies the open wound in a society, hunger, humiliation, inequality, fear, and offers itself as the cure. Hitler understood Versailles. The German people had been told they lost the war because of traitors from within. He offered them someone to blame and someone to follow. Stalin offered the workers ownership of everything. Mao offered China its dignity. Pol Pot offered Cambodia its past. Hitler offered Germany its future. Here is the question nobody asks. Were they lying? Not entirely, and that is what makes it so dangerous. The wound was real. The hunger was real. The humiliation was real. The promise gave people something genuine, hope. And hope, once offered, is extraordinarily difficult to take back, even when the people offering it begin to reveal what they really are. Because by the time the mask slips, the machine is already running. Phase 2. The enemy within. Once in power, every regime in this video did the same thing. They invented an enemy. Not an external enemy. Armies and foreign powers are useful for short-term rallying cries, but they don't explain why the promised paradise hasn't arrived yet. For that, you need something more insidious. You need an enemy who lives among the people, who looks like a neighbor, who works at the factory, who teaches at the school. Stalin called them kulaks, wealthy peasants, supposedly hoarding grain while the workers starved. He launched a campaign of collectivization that sent millions to the gulags. And when people asked why the food was still scarce, the answer was always the same. The kulaks, the saboteurs, the enemies hiding in plain sight. In China, Mao targeted intellectuals, landowners, and eventually his own party. During the Cultural Revolution, university professors were dragged into the streets. and humiliated by teenagers with red books. Libraries were burned. History was rewritten. Children informed on their parents. In Cambodia, Pol Pot targeted anyone who wore glasses, because glasses meant you were educated, and education meant you were a city person, and city people were the enemy. Doctors, teachers, engineers, slaughtered. A country that emptied its own hospitals. Do you see the mechanism? The enemy does two things at once. First, it explains the gap between the promise and the reality. Paradise hasn't arrived because the enemy is sabotaging it. Second, it creates a loyalty test. You prove you belong by denouncing someone else. The regime doesn't even need to find all its enemies. It just needs people to start looking for them. And they always do. In Nazi Germany, the machinery of persecution didn't spring fully formed into the streets. It was built gradually. Laws, then restrictions, then deportations. Each step normalized before the next one began. By the time the death camps were operational, the logic of the enemy had been embedded so deeply into everyday German life that most people either participated or chose deliberately not to ask questions. That is the true power of Phase 2, not cruelty, complicity. Phase 3, the machine. By Phase 3, the regime has something it didn't need in the beginning, a machine. Not a political machine, not a military machine, an apparatus of total control, propaganda, surveillance, fear, and reward, designed to make the population complicit in its own oppression. Stalin's NKVD, Mao's Public Security Bureau, the Khmer Rouge's S-21 prison, the Gestapo, each one operated on the same principle. You don't need to arrest everyone. You only need people to believe you might arrest anyone. That distinction is everything. In East Germany, the Stasi employed one informant for every 63 citizens. 1 in 63. And what did it produce? A country where people stopped talking freely, in cafes, in bedrooms, in their own thoughts, because you never knew who was listening. How do you control a population of millions with a bureaucracy of thousands? You make the population control itself. That is what propaganda is actually for. Not to convince people of a lie. That's the simple version. Propaganda's deeper function is to make people perform loyalty. When you force someone to march in a parade, display a portrait, denounce a colleague, you are not convincing them of anything. You are making them complicit, and complicity is far more binding than belief, because you cannot undo what you have already done. Phase 3 also attacks the past. Every totalitarian regime eventually rewrites history, because the past contains inconvenient truths about who they were before the promise. Stalin had photographs altered, former allies airbrushed from official images. Pol Pot declared year zero. History itself was abolished. Mao launched the Cultural Revolution to destroy the old world. Because if you control what people believe about the past, you control what they think is possible for the future. That is the machine, and it is extraordinarily difficult to dismantle once it is running. Before we get to Phase 4, and this is the phase that holds the most unsettling lesson, make sure to subscribe to Epoch Insight and hit the notification bell. We do this every week. History that actually explains the world you're living in right now. Not because someone finally recognized the evil and stopped it. Not because a hero emerged with the right argument at the right moment. They collapsed because the machine, by its very nature, contains the seeds of its own destruction. Here is how it works. The promise requires results. You told the people paradise was coming. You told them the enemy was sabotaging it. But at some point, years in, sometimes decades, people stop believing the enemy explanation. The food is still scarce. The poverty is still real. The gap between the promise and the reality becomes too wide. And so the regime doubles down. It purges harder. It invents new enemies. And in doing so, it begins to eat itself. Stalin killed his own generals in the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938. When Hitler invaded in 1941, the Red Army was so gutted by its own leader's paranoia that it suffered catastrophic losses in the opening months of the war. The machine had turned on the machine. Pol Pot went further. The Khmer Rouge began executing its own cadres for suspected loyalty to Vietnam, to China, to anyone. By the end, S-21 prison was killing more Khmer Rouge members than actual enemies. Mao's Cultural Revolution consumed the very intellectuals and party officials who had built the Chinese state. By the time it ended, China had destroyed its own expertise, its doctors, engineers, professors, in the name of ideological purity. Why does it always crack? Because no system built on lies is stable. The energy required to maintain the fiction grows exponentially over time. The regime must work harder and harder to suppress more and more truth. Until the day it can't. In Romania, it happened in 6 days. Nicolae Ceausescu, who had ruled for 24 years, gave a speech on the 21st of December, 1989, expecting the usual staged applause. Instead, the crowd booed. He was so shocked he stopped mid-sentence. He was executed 4 days later. The machine, once it started to crack, didn't slow down. It shattered. The pattern crystallized so. Here is the pattern, distilled. A promise that exploited a real wound. An enemy that explained why the promise hadn't arrived yet. A machine that made the population complicit in its own oppression. And a collapse that came only when the machine could no longer sustain its own lies. That is the sequence. Every single regime in this video followed it, and it has never, not once, failed to repeat. Which brings us to the uncomfortable part. This pattern is not ancient history. It is not a problem that humanity solved at Nuremberg or in the ruins of the Berlin Wall. The pattern is a template, and it is being used right now. Not necessarily at the scale of the 20th century, not yet, but the sequence is recognizable. The identification of internal enemies, the attacks on institutions that check power, courts, press, universities, the rewriting of history to serve the present, the demand for loyalty performances. You don't need gas chambers for the pattern to be running. The pattern starts long before the gas chambers. By the time those come, it's already deep in phase 3. What this means for you. The purpose of understanding history's deadliest regimes is not to catalog suffering. It is to understand the mechanism. Because a mechanism once understood can be interrupted, and you cannot interrupt what you cannot see. Every regime in this video depended on one assumption, shared by most people inside it, that this was not possible. That what was happening was an exception, a temporary measure, that it would stop soon. It didn't stop soon. It stopped when the machine broke. Millions of people paid for that assumption with their lives. The question history is asking, and has always been asking, is whether the next generation can recognize the pattern early enough to change the outcome. That is what this channel is for. If this video gave you something to think about, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Epoch Insight, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. And let us know in the comments, which regime do you think the world has forgotten most dangerously? And do you see this pattern anywhere today? We read every comment, because this conversation doesn't end here.